Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. So nice to have you here today. Good afternoon, or maybe good morning, depending on where you might be zooming in from. Welcome to today's book launch event with our co-authors, Dr. Joyce Bellous and Dr. Margaret Clark. For the book, here it is, Thick Listening at Thin Moments. We're really delighted and excited to be here together today with these two authors and also with a discussant who will respond to the book and share a bit about her experience having read the book, Dr. Leslie Gardner. My name is Fred Tappenden. I am the principal and dean at St. Stephen's College at the University of Alberta, which is located in Edmonton. We're really pleased to be hosting this event and excited to be sharing this book with all of you. Let me pop a link into the chat really quick. This is a link for the publisher's website for the book. Tall Pine Press is the publisher of this fine volume. And I've been told today that this week, the press has made available a 10% discount for those of you who are attending this event. So if you want to pick up the book, you can save 10% if you order it at Tall Pine. The discount code is book launch, all one word. I've just put that information into the chat, so you can access it there and throughout the event. As I said, my name is Fred Tappenden, the principal and dean at St. Stephen's. As we do with all St. Stephen's events, I want to take some time to open our gathering by recognizing and remembering the space on which we reside here at St. Stephen's, space on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton. Here at the college, we respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on sacred lands, lands that are sacred to many peoples. The territory of Treaty 6 is a traditional meeting ground, gathering place, traveling route for the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Blackfoot, the Papachase, the Dene, the Nakota Sioux, and many other First Peoples. We acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis and Inuit, whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries, and with whom we strive evermore to live in right relations. And I also recognize that many of you are zooming in from many other places and many other lands. And if you want to take a moment and pop into the chat the lands from which you're coming, please feel free to share land acknowledgements. It's important, I think, to remember the breadth of spaces from which we come and to think of the places in which we live and breathe and reside. Today's event is brought to you by St. Stephen's College, together with the Alberta Consortium for Supervised Pastoral Education. This is a provincial body that gives leadership to CPE and clinical psychospiritual education in the province of Alberta. We're really happy to be featuring this book since it is such an important work, I think, for what we do with clinical psychospiritual education. A quick note here, we are all on Zoom. So I just want to invite us all to please keep our mics muted. Zoom works by picking up whatever sound it hears. And because we're recording, we want to make sure the focus stays on our presenters. Later on in the event, we will have a time for conversation and discussion. And at that time, invite you to unmute your mic and you can ask the questions you want to ask. But for the presentations, we'll try to keep it focused on our presenters. You're welcome to keep your cameras on, though I do encourage you, if you're finding that you have a delay or a lag, it could be a bandwidth issue. So you might try toggling your camera off if you're finding there's a bit of a lag. And also just to remind us all, especially for those who came on a bit late, this Zoom call is being recorded and we will be posting this to the college's YouTube channel a little bit later on. So just so we're all aware that recording is happening. The format of our meeting today is pretty simple. We're going to hear first from the authors, Dr. Joyce Bellous and Dr. Margaret Clark. They will each come and share from their experiences of having written the book, but they'll also share what they each see to be the primary contributions of this volume. And after they're done sharing, we'll invite Dr. Leslie Gardner, who I think has been a conversation partner with Joyce and Margaret and a bit of a reviewer also of Joyce and Margaret's book here. Dr. Leslie Gardner will come and offer a response, sharing from her experiences of having read the book, but also her experience of what she thinks the book contributes. That'll take maybe 30 or 40 minutes. And after that, we'll open up our time to some conversations, discussions. I encourage you all, as you're listening to our speakers, jot down any questions you have and be ready to ask them at the end. And we'll have a time of discussion to conclude our hour and a half together. Good. So without further ado, I will start with our first speaker. Dr. Margaret Clark is a certified supervisor educator in spiritual care. That's in the CPE stream. That certification is through the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care here in Canada. Her lifetime CPE activities span parish, healthcare, and academic settings in both the United States and in Canada. This book, Thick Listening at Thin Moments, this is her second book. Her first book was Nursing Within a Faith Community, Promoting Health in Times of Transition. That was published in 2000 by Sage and co-authored with Joanne Olson. Dr. Clark is also an associate faculty member here at St. Stephen's, where she serves on our DMin committee, our Doctor of Ministry committee. She serves on our board, and she's also served at various times on our academic senate. Margaret, it's such a joy to have you here, and we invite you to share with us about this very fine book.
Thanks, Fred. And thanks to all of you who are here. Thanks to St. Stephen's for this opportunity to talk about our book. And thanks to family, friends, and colleagues who are there. It's wonderful to see your names arise. Some whom I know, some whom I don't know, some whom I just feel great awe for over the years. So as Fred mentioned, we have two questions, Joyce and I, to look at. The first is our experience of writing the book. And the second is any contributions we feel the book might make to this conversation about spiritual care practice, psychospiritual education. So when I look at my experience of writing the book, it took us from probably, 2019 through 2022. I would divide it into three areas. And the first area is what I call my Eeyore phase. Eeyore is a character in Winnie the Pooh, and he's the donkey. And at times I felt in the face of Joyce's invitation that I too was like a donkey, like Eeyore, just kind of putting my hoofs in the ground and kind of resisting even as I was going along. But it didn't take me very long before I got caught up in the experience of learning and began to see the wonderful connection between action and theory, and really loved the sentence in action science literature that all action is theory driven. And when I was thinking about this more recently, I was thinking that there may be some parallels for people who consider to read our book, that there might be an initial resistance to reading something that is so theoretical until the learning experience kicks in and one or other or several of the theories take root and begin to become part of your personal and professional reflection. A second phase really was colored throughout by the COVID-19 pandemic. And Joyce and I met weekly by Zoom on Wednesday mornings. And we worked our way through the composition of the book's chapters and the visioning of the book as a whole. The pace was slow but steady and distinctively collaborative. It was just wonderful to explore and discover and experience the collaborative work that Joyce and I could do. And then thirdly, I was aware that as we collaborated across our differences as two strong women, that things such as curiosity and being able to articulate our differences became really, really rich and important. So a couple of images popped up for me, and one of them was a rock tumbler, put in all the kind of the surfaces that are rough and experience them being smoothed out over time. And I think it was inquiry and mutual respect and shared discovery that helped Joyce and I really be changed in the experience of writing our book. A second image is that of a refiner's fire. We faithfully endeavor to let the insignificant and unimportant aspects of our work melt away like dross, so that the pure and essential content could be clearly expressed. And in this, we both had to give up some of our prized theories and our prized stories. So in summary, in terms of writing the book, I would say that I could never have imagined in 2019 what I'm deeply, deeply grateful for in 2023. The second question is contributions, and I'd like to just highlight two. The first is the book's title, Thick Listening at Thin Moments. Over the years of our book's development, when sharing this title, people have resonated and made comments about liking it. Something seems to touch a chord of familiarity that people identify with. It may be called by different names, but its essence has to do with thick listening and with the phenomena of thin moments. So I want to speak to that briefly. And then the second highlight I'd like to offer is the contribution that I feel our book might offer in terms of competency, education, competency, competence, complex competence, and skills acquisition as they apply to spiritual care practice, using thick listening at thin moments as a focal point. So I have a few slides I'd like to share to develop these two contributions. And then I'll be finished. So first of all, where did the phrase thick listening at thin moments come from? And secondly, what has the phrase thick listening at thin moments come to mean to me in the writing of our book? So there's two phases. The phrase thick listening at thin moments first came in 1999 when I was preparing to teach a class on theological reflection at St. Stephen's College. And in preparing, I read, it was in preparation for the turn of the century and the turn of the millennium. And Maria Harris wrote a book called Proclaim Jubilee, a spirituality for the 21st century. And she asked Walter Brueggemann to write the foreword. And in that foreword, he talks about Harris's use of thick listening as a way of speaking about prayer. So that caught my attention. I found that fascinating. And then during that same summer, I had the opportunity to attend a talk by Thomas Groom, who was promoting his book on sharing faith. And in that, he makes reference to Celtic spirituality that perceives thin moments as places where separation between worlds is thin. So what I did was, after pondering and ruminating and letting it ripen inside of me, is I put Harris's and Groom's terms together and formulated a question. And the question is, can you imagine thick listening as a quality of multidimensional contemplative mindfulness that understands and appreciates the deep interfacing between everyday experiences and thin moments where separations between about different worldviews, paradigms, and filters become increasingly thin and transformative? So that's kind of the way I used thick listening at thin moments for 20 years. And then in working with Joyce, that phrase began to just expand immensely. So in our book, we've got a description of thick listening and a description of thin moments, and I'll just go over those very briefly. Thick listening, while not exclusively so, is a spiritual care competency. And that's worth playing with. It's a quality of listening that is thick, not only with attentiveness to the other, but also concurrently with attentiveness to oneself. That twofold listening, outward and inward, is really so important. It's an ability to be fully oneself while being fully present to another, an ongoing process. It's an ability to practice the safe and effective use of self in skilled and meaningful relational ways. And lastly, it grows and matures with experience. So thick listening at thin moments is a lifetime adventure. Secondly, what is a thin moment? And in the book, we say that a thin moment is something we notice in our own or in someone else's experience. And in that noticing, we pause to look at, contemplate, and show reverence for the layered awareness of being in more than one place at a time. That's characteristic of a thin moment. Thin moments have a liminal quality. They occur in spaces between worlds. They're moments of loss, trauma, and exhilaration, to name some examples, that surprise us by happening after. They surprise our worldview and our experience after life is as usual and before something new and new normal evolves. And thirdly, thin moments are more than life-changing events. They're touch points that take a person to their very core of transformation. So that is my response to the first, the sense of a first contribution. I think the title, which is woven throughout the book, and it's what Joyce and I kept chewing on and chewing on and chewing on when we were interfacing with all of the other theories that are available in the book. The second is competency-based learning. And it's distinctive, and it's what I think spiritual care practitioners are working with much more now, as distinct from concept-based learning or context-based learning or course-based learning is competency-based learning. So in chapter 7, we approach the concept of competency through hermeneutics, social interaction, and multiple literacies. And then we look at the distinct words competency as an ability that relies on basic attributes of a person's character, motives, traits, self-concept. We have two self-concepts, a traditional self-concept, and then one that Joyce and I played with in terms of some of the other theory in the book around worldview, map and model, and then knowledge and skills. So competency is far more than knowledge and skills. It has to do with our character, our attitudes, and our motives and traits, and so on, our self-awareness. Second word is competence. So this is a person's degree of accomplishing something as compared with an ideal performance of these characteristics. So competence is something that's measurable. And this is where we can look at a competency assessment. And then the third is the word complex competency, which discovered by accident. And so in our book, we introduced that term complex competency as comprised of two or more distinct competencies that have been personally and professionally integrated and embodied into something new, a cohesive and seamlessly exercised complex set of spiritual care skills. So these three words, and I think in our lists in North America of competencies, when we go back and we look at them in light of the concept of complex competency, is to expand that term and understand it, because I think most of our lists are complex competencies. And the last thing I want to do is share a little bit about assessing competency. And here in chapter 8, we've taken the 7 stages of skills acquisition that Hubert Dreyfus develops. He initially started developing this in 1980, and then he wrote a book called On the Internet in 2001, which you can download as a PDF file. But in that book, he's asking the question, can we learn competence strictly on the internet, strictly through electronic methods? And he says, no, that we need embodied people to learn from. And he develops 7 stages of skills acquisition. So what we've done in our book is, in chapter 8, is try to look at those in terms of spiritual care practice. So Dreyfus's stages, I'll list them, and then I'll just mention the stories that explore them, and that'll be my conclusion to this, reflection. The first is the stage of novice, and here Howard meets Mrs. Corazon. It's very basic. It's learning how to ask, enter the room, stay in the room long enough and know when to leave, that kind of thing. Advanced beginner, where Barbara provides care following a death, and she has more details that she attends to in that activity. Thirdly, we have the competent learner, and here we have two examples. The first is Leon, who learns from a mixed denominational family and a Roman Catholic priest, more complex, but lots of learning as he reflected on the experience. And then Marta, who learned from an Indigenous patient and a cultural helper. She made a mistake in what she did, and in the face of that mistake, she learned from both the patient and the cultural helper. And I think that learning from mistakes is really essential to learning any competency. Fourth, the proficient learner. Here we have Ruth, who decides to go beyond the usual boundaries. She makes a decision that puts her a little bit into an ethical dilemma, which I think is something we need to keep aware of and be attentive to. Fifth is the expert, and we went back and drew on Rose, whom we develop in chapter 2. We look at her CPE journey through some of the other theory in chapter 2. And we look at how she has become over her life, her professional life, specialized in palliative care. She does research, and she is preceptor in CPE students. Dreyfus's sixth stage is being masterful, and this has to do with personal style. And here we have the stories of Charlie and Jack, two people who were friends in theological college and then regrew their friendship as they ministered together in rural Montana, both with very different relational styles, but both very powerful and effective pastors. And lastly is the stage of practical wisdom, which Dreyfus calls one that has to do with cultural style. And here we have the story of Anita from Canada and In-Soo from South Korea, exploring CPE learning across cultural differences. So that's my reflections on both the experience of writing the book and of some of the contributions, hopefully, that the book can make. So back over to you, Fred, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Margaret. And just a reminder, and actually, first of all, welcome to those who have jumped into the Zoom call a little bit late. We're very glad you're here, and we are recording, so the whole session will be available at a later date. Thank you, Margaret, so much. I'm so glad you took us into the title of this book, which I have said in many contexts, I think is one of the best titles of any book I've seen. I'm a scripture scholar. I'm trained in interpretation, and I've always been really drawn to the anthropologist Clifford Geertz's notion of thick description.
Yes.
And as soon as I heard this title, Thick Listening at Thin Moments, there is such a rich title because it captures, I think, the gravity of the task of a care provider in the midst of the fragility of such a careful moment, thick listening at thin moments. So thank you so much for elaborating on that. Let's welcome our other author, the lead author on this book, Joyce Bellous. Joyce, very happy to have you here. Let me give a bit of an introduction to you. Dr. Joyce Bellous is a university professor, transformational educator, a leader, a consultant, a mentor, a social interaction theorist, and an international speaker. She has expertise in analyzing human systems and encouraging productive involvement within those systems. Her primary research is in the area of human spirituality. Her prior books with Tall Pine Press include Spiritual Styles, Assessing What Really Matters. In here, there are 2 volumes, one for adults and one for children, and they were co-authored with David Sisanos, Denise Peltomaki, and Karen Bellous. Joyce has also written Conversations That Change Us, Learning the Art of Theological Reflection, co-written with Dan Sheffield, and also Educating Faith, An Approach to Christian Formation. Joyce, we're very happy to have you here. We're very happy to read this book and celebrate with you and invite you to share your experience of writing it and what you see as its major contributions.
Oh, thanks, Fred, for all the support that you've given us. We really appreciate this opportunity, and hi to everybody. I'm grateful I had the good sense to talk Margaret into writing this book with me. Neither of us could have written it by ourselves. And I learned a great deal that was personally formative and transformative by working through this text, this very good book with Margaret. Now, if you're someone who wants to help other people through complex aspects of their lives, chapter 1 is essential reading. Brain research in that chapter explains how worldviews form in the first place. Understanding how worldviews form through perceptual and conceptual learning is a necessary first step in helping people figure out their own faith story. Being aware of how learning and unlearning work helps people reflect intentionally on their relationship with the past in the context of a present moment that they find themselves in, whether they're in hospitals, prisons, not-for-profit agencies, at church, in the workplace, or at home. Worldviews are accumulated meaning systems based on personal as well as social experience. Understanding how worldviews form is perhaps the most important move you make in realizing your aspiration to be the best spiritual care practitioner that you can be. That is what thick listening is about. It's about listening to yourself as well as listening to other people at the same time. Thick listening also has implications for human maturity. A worldview is a repository of what's happened to us during the specific historical times we live in. To move toward maturity, everyone needs to reflect on their organizing principles. In the same way, a good novel moves forward based on asking and answering its organizing idea. But for example, a murder mystery moves ahead by asking and answering the question, who done it? An organizing principle might be to gather as much wealth, pleasure, or success as possible. An organizing principle might be someone's compulsion to move, to prove that they're worthy of acceptance and love. But our lives are not clear and neat like novels. We need witnesses and companions to help us hear our own faith story and to reflect intentionally on it. Thick listening is about recognizing what's driving us and asking ourselves whether those ideas are the ones we want to continue relying upon. Of course, that assumes people want to move forward. And many of you offer spiritual care to people who seem stuck in the moment where you meet them. Thick listening is about strategies that help people get unstuck. What are some of those sticky places? I think it's fair to say that our own worldviews, our own pasts, are two of the stickiest places that keep us glued down. The forward movement is about progress, not perfection. Let me read to you about Nancy from chapter 6 in Thick Listening at Thin Moments. Perhaps it's because so many people live longer now that the opportunity to rethink our worldviews is more than an option. It's a requirement for living well in the 21st century. Recall from chapter 1 that worldviews form in a particular way that allows human beings to perceive more and more of what's going on in their environments. Conceptual learning allows them to strengthen and extend the meaning they organize and live by. Simply walking away from what's new and confusing isn't the best way to employ the brain's potential. Spiritual work is the ongoing task of grappling with meanings we've gathered about others, about the world, about the transcendent, about nature and ourselves, because the human brain is designed for ongoing, conceptual learning. We get our worldviews initially not because they're true. We build them based on personal experience and family contexts. Let's look at an example of conceptual learning. Suppose Nancy grew up with an absentee father. She learned from experience, her mother's behavior, her own disappointment, that he was away because he found other tasks, other people, other places more interesting than spending time with family. Of course, everyone in her family may have misunderstood his motivation for being gone and been unaware of the role played by his lack of the social and emotional skills needed to communicate his love convincingly. That being said, as a result of her early experience, Nancy built particular associations with and beliefs about the concepts for man, husband, father, in which she believed her dad didn't want to spend time with family because they weren't interesting to him. Then Nancy married Jim, who in his mid-30s was required by his workplace to be away from home a lot of the time. As she pays attention to her own spiritual needs and uses relational communication, Nancy comes to see that Jim is not her father. She's able to perceive Jim's love for her and their children. By remaining open to what's going on, she revises her concepts for husband, father, man, in such a way that being absent is not the same as indifference. Jim is committed to family, prefers to be at home, and is fully present when he's there. The shift involved in Nancy's conceptual learning is enormous. Initially, the contradiction between her father-based husband concept from the past and her revised concept of Jim in the present moves her thinking forward as she tries to understand herself. She begins to notice her relational environment and uses these perceptions to help her reconceive her concepts. She takes in new information that allows her to re-examine the content of her old concepts and to question her beliefs. She gets distance from her old concepts and observes them change based on her new experience. Most importantly, she trusts Jim enough to hear with fresh insight his reasons for why he's doing what he's doing. She releases her grip on old concepts and lets them be informed by her new reality. By doing this work, Nancy is able to perceive Jim's humanity in a way she couldn't before. Nancy doesn't pretend she never had negative concepts, nor does she believe she can just walk away from them. Her emerging concepts interact with old concepts, and the old concepts influence the emerging ones. The old is part of the configuration of the new. What she learns from being in relationship with Jim is new and challenges what she previously thought about all men. Up to now, her old concepts controlled her assumptions. When she experiences a conceptual shift, she can intentionally weigh and reflect on her concepts of man, father, husband, rather than being controlled by them. Through mental awareness as an aspect of mindfulness, she's able to consider past and present at the same time. She practices trusting Jim. Trust is a choice and sometimes a difficult one. Her conceptual tension is between old concepts and emerging ones. This is a struggle Nancy has to engage in herself. Jim can participate, but the conceptual learning is essentially hers. Jim needs to do his own spiritual work. This conceptual movement is seldom sudden and requires awareness of what's going on between past and present. The old concepts can still pop up, but less so as trust builds. When Nancy reflects on what she's thinking, her idea of Jim moves closer to his actual being. The outcome of rethinking her concepts is that Jim can show up as the person that he is. Up to now, he was hidden from view, covered by her patchwork cloak of old concepts. Rethinking one's worldview has other benefits as well. As her father ages, Nancy loves being in his presence and has released him from her youthful anger. In this chapter, we focus on how reason plays out in conceptual shifts like the one Nancy experienced. We also look at concepts. We also look at people who refuse to let new experiences reshape old concepts. So thick listening at thin moments offers someone's life story more aliveness as they grasp the meaning that drives them and as they decide whether it's the meaning they want to take with them into the future. So much of the last century talked us into believing that living into the future means walking away from the past. That isn't possible. Even cells in our body remember. Repressing the past is not the way the brain-body relationship works best. Spiritual care is about helping people make peace with the past and adapt to current circumstances without losing themselves in the process. Thick listening conveys theories and practices to help us listen to someone's faith story by helping them hear it for themselves without trying to silence it, without being stuck in it. Spiritual care is about small steps of forward movement. Thick listening is about being a companion to people as they become intentionally reflective of their own precious humanity. Spiritual care responds compassionately to the hunger of this current age. People are starving for spiritual sustenance. It's a privilege to be involved in the pursuit of spiritual understanding. I recommend the books Thick Listening at Thin Moments as an important, maybe a pivotal way to pursue what it means to be spiritually mature human beings and excellent, skilled spiritual care practitioners. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joyce. So nice to hear an excerpt of the book. Appreciate that so much. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to pop in the chat here again, a link to the publisher's website, and there's also the discount code there, book launch. For those who joined late, the publisher is for this week doing a 10% discount for anyone who buys the book from the publisher's website. So feel free to log on and do so. And I've got the book right here. It's on its second cover. It's actually had a cover update, and I love the cover. It's such a nice color. And I will say Tall Pine did a really nice job with this book. The formatting is great. The layout is nice. The printing is nice. Each chapter has a set of questions for reflection. I don't know if you can read that or not, but there's lots of good Lots of good material in here. Leslie, Dr. Leslie Gardner, why don't you come and share with us as a discussant, a respondent here to Joyce and to Margaret. Let me give you a brief introduction and then we'll turn it over to you. Dr. Leslie Gardner is an associate faculty member here at St. Stephen's College. She has been involved with St. Stephen's for 35 or so years. She serves on the Doctor of Ministry Program Committee. She teaches annually our Inquiry, Research, and Evaluation course. She has over 20 years experience in program evaluation, assisting in the public sector and with voluntary organizations in process and outcomes evaluation. Leslie, we're very grateful to have you here and excited for what you have to say.
Thanks so much, Fred. I'm so grateful to be part of this gathering, and hello to everyone who has come to share the moment with us. Well, let me say right off that I love this book. Reading this book is like sitting down with a trusted mentor and friend. And I think its significant contribution is its accessibility and relevance to not only those involved in various levels of spiritual care provision and those who are training to be spiritual care providers, but also to any one of us. This point is actually made early in the book in the introduction to the concept of thick listening at thin moments as a complex competency. So I will quote from the book, if I may. The authors tell us, when carried forward in combination by professional spiritual care practitioners and also ordinary people who tend to the needs of the human spirit, this twofold competency comes alive in the here and now to foster right relationship, healing, and wholeness. I had the opportunity to review the book in an earlier manuscript, and coming back to it now, I'm impressed all over again by what I see as its holistic balance and integration among a number of elements. And it's the balance and integration of material that is accessible and relevant to all of us that I want to focus on today. That material comes particularly from chapters 1, 2, and 4. So I'd like to address 4 specific areas, and those are worldview, something really dear to my heart, accessible definitions, a clear approach to intentional reflection, and how elements of spiritual care can be used in our daily lives to enrich our relationships. So first, I wanted to tell you where I'm coming from and my perspective, and thank you, Fred, for giving a little bit of that context. As Fred mentioned, I am an associate faculty member at St. Steve's College. I am the main instructor for one of our core and foundational courses for all master's and doctoral level students, and this course is called Inquiry, Research, and Evaluation. Since 2010, when this course, this version of the course began, because of my professional interest as an evaluator and my exposure through projects I was involved in to Indigenous ways of knowing and being, the course began then and now with an examination of worldview and its importance to our own research. We have done this by introducing students to the books by Wilson and Kovacs in Canada and Chalissa in Africa on Indigenous research methods. So we're encouraging people to reflect on our own worldview by engaging with one very different from our own. At St. Steve's, we speak of our work and learning as being spiritually informed. And I believe that one of the solid contributions of this book is not only a clear and accessible description of how worldview is formed for all of us and how it can change and grow, but also an explicit connection between spirituality and worldview that leads us to a deep recognition of how we can be spiritually informed and are spiritually informed and need to be aware of how we are spiritually informed. So I'd like to share with you a seminal quote from the first chapter. Through the spiritual work of relating to objects, for example, people, events, and places, from the time we're born and throughout our life, the meaning we make from these encounters establishes and perpetuates assumptions, beliefs, and values that form our worldview. That worldview shapes how people interpret what they can expect from life, from other people, from nature, from the transcendent, and from themselves. A formative worldview is at the heart of the way people live their lives. We're also told one's worldview has the potential to mature through intentional reflection on experience. Working out an adult worldview that we intentionally choose to hold by reflecting on the one that we fashioned when we were young is meaningful work that is supported through our spirituality, our spiritual experiences, and spiritual care. And the authors increase the accessibility of this important process for all of us by emphasizing how our personal stories give us a way into our worldview. Our stories give shape to our worldview. And as the authors say, our stories enable us to self-reflect and make faith sense of our everyday lives. So before getting into a description of this book's clear approach to this kind of intentional reflection, I want to draw our attention to one of the most distinctive and appealing aspects of the book. And this is the broad approach that the authors take to the definition of foundational concepts like faith and spirituality that help make what they say so accessible and relevant to everyone, no matter what traditional faith or no professed faith perspective that people have. The authors tell us that faith is being in relationship with others, whether persons, places, things, or that which transcends tangible knowing. Similarly, they suggest that spirituality needs to be understood as embodied self-expression that's grounded in the human capacity for experiencing a sense of felt connection. We can all remember a sense of felt connection with ourselves, with others, with nature, with the divine. One of the major contributions of the book that is relevant for all of us is the way that the authors make spiritual and theological reflection as the intentional way of reflecting on our lives and our worldview so accessible and clear. To do this, they shift away from the understanding of the variety of models of theological and spiritual reflection that are cited in so many well-known books on the subject. Instead, they recall the work of F.A. Hayek on two aspects of worldview formation, a map and a model. The authors tell us that a map is the big picture of accumulated experience that's multidimensional and multi-layered and defines the relationship of everything to everything else in a worldview. Whereas a model is a moment of social interaction experienced within a map. The map is the familiar against which the model is placed. The map is the standard into which a model is supposed to fit. And if it fits, it will give us a sense of continuity, identity, direction, and value to our worldview. But sometimes the model does not fit with the worldview. There's a lack of fit. And this may create tension and dissonance and uncomfortable feelings. that the authors say may give rise to a thin moment in which the safeguards of all the familiar are shaken up. In spiritual care, thick listening occurs at those thin moments. Thick listening is the method for hearing what's happening at those thin moments. Thick listening at the moments as method is at the heart of spiritual reflection and theological reflection. So, to repeat, the map is about worldview. The model is about a moment of social interaction against the backdrop of the map. And thin moments are model experiences that may evoke dissonance over a lack of fit with one's worldview. And they then become moments for intentional reflection. As such, those thin moments are the major source for spiritual and theological reflection. Now, I'd like to add, you remember Margaret said that some of those moments are moments of exhilaration. So I wanted to add and draw our attention to the fact that those thin moments might also be times of noticeable match or enhancement between the map and the model. We've all experienced those numinous moments when things that are familiar and ordinary are suddenly seen as holy or in technicolor or in high definition. And those thin moments also invite that kind of intentional reflection. Now, the authors go on to explain that there are 4 key and interconnected points of entry to one's worldview map. And those are self, other, tradition, and culture. I love this description, the metaphor that they use of this entry, these 4 points being like touching a square of Jell-O, because no matter what the point of contact, the whole square jiggles. Whatever the initial touch point of connection, all 4 pathways of insight will be impacted by that reflection. Now, the authors give us a detailed example of intentional reflection by telling the story of various points of entry into the map of the worldview of a woman who is going through her master's in theological studies and its clinical pastoral education experiences and tasks. The story illustrates the 4 points of entry into the map of her worldview through different thin moments in her spiritual care education. This story makes the process of intentional reflection available and accessible to the rest of us. We're given a clear example of what the process looks like and how to do it. The 4th and final example of the balance and integration of material that makes this book relevant to every one of us is found in chapter 4. In this material, the authors stress that as human beings, we are made for relationship. Their message is clear that although spiritual care is a profession, it is also, I love this expression, an attitude toward the world. It is a way we can give each to the other, where everyone would benefit. Now, the authors at this point introduce us to a really rich ecological image of relational habitat maintenance. They propose that all of us include spiritual care in all our relational environments, such as home, office, school, with family, coworkers, colleagues. We all could offer spiritual care as thick listening at thin moments to others in whatever situation we're in. And the characteristic of what that care would look like is given to us and carefully laid out for us in terms of the requirements of the human spirit. Significantly, this includes giving people our full attention to show them that they're included, that they're welcomed with hospitality, that they're acknowledged and accepted for who they are. The authors put it this way: really hearing the meaning-making effort of another person, helping them feel safe, and finding relief through an experience of being fully seen and heard is at the heart of spiritual care. The authors go on to describe two aspects of this kind of attentiveness to another person in their discussion of gaze and embrace that are available to each of us. Gaze refers to the caring connection that can happen in using non-threatening, continuous eye contact, remembering, however, the cultural understanding of such behavior, and that some cultures might find such gaze to be aggressive or even disrespectful. Now, the example of the importance of this gaze in our everyday lives can be seen in a story I know about a little girl who's telling her father about her day while he's working on his computer. "Go ahead," he keeps saying, "I'm listening." "But Daddy," she finally cries, "I need you to listen with your eyes." With regard to embrace, we're told that an embrace can be physical, social, or spiritual. And embracing is a way of being present to another so that the attention we pay is to them, not to the issue or the problem that they might be experiencing. In the spirit of safe and effective use of self, that is a key competency in spiritual care provision, the authors help us to see and practice that embracing is the ability and the willingness to hold in the right way, at the right time, for the right amount of time, for the right reasons. The authors also make the point that we can give this deep attention to ourselves as well, and that self-care and care of others go together. They caution us that we can't possibly engage others relationally if we don't engage ourselves reflectively. They also say, knowing that what is required when someone gives of oneself wholeheartedly for a specific period of time, that regaining oneself is the most appropriate response. In summary and in conclusion, we're so grateful for this wonderful book, Thick Listening at Thin Moments, that gives us a holistic, balanced, and integrated view of worldview and why it matters, clear and accessible definitions of faith and spirituality, a solid understanding of intentional reflection, and shows how elements of spiritual care can enhance our everyday interactions. These contributions are relevant and accessible not only to those formally involved in the study of spiritual care practice, but to every one of the rest of us, educators, healthcare providers, and actually anyone who is interested in understanding and improving their relationships. We thank these authors. We thank them for showing us that spiritual care is indeed an attitude toward the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Appreciate that response so much. And thank you for sharing your experience of reading the book and many contributions that you see in it. And thank you, Joyce and Margaret, for sharing as well. We want to open it up now to some time for conversation and discussion. So those of you who've attended, we've loved seeing you here. And I invite anyone who wants to ask a question or offer a comment, please feel free to do so. You can do so either by raising your hands, and to do that, I mean, you could just do it like this, but we can do it in a digital format as well. There is a button on Zoom called Reactions, and in Reactions, there's a raise hand button, and that will create a bit of a queue. Simon's already on it. So you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you one at a time. Or if you have other questions that you want to put into the chat, please feel free to do so. I'll keep an eye on the chat and monitor the chats, and we might have a few questions that are similar, and I can sort of lump them together. So Simon, please go ahead and ask your first question. Feel free to lower your hand too once you finish your question.
Margaret and Joyce, thanks so much for writing this book. I feel super excited about the contribution that it's making to the emerging urgency for a theory for spiritual care. And as you both know, I'm kind of engaged in my own efforts to articulate a theory of spiritual care, and I feel like I'm learning a lot from this discussion and from the parts of the book that I've already read. And so thank you for this incredible resource that you've given us. One thing that I'm a little bit curious about, and I'm wondering if you could comment on this a little bit, is that I was interested, Joyce, in the excerpt that you read on the focus on the conceptual shifts that we go through as we reflect upon our own stories and our own spiritualities and this sort of thing. And in my own practice of spiritual care and in my own reflections on spirituality, I often think that in some ways those conceptual shifts occur after the fact, after I've already begun doing the emotional work of disentangling myself from the emotions that I've carried with me from my past into the present.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, how do you see that emotional work occurring within the context of spiritual care, with the understanding that those conceptual shifts are probably the most obvious manifestation of the emotional shifts that have already occurred?
Yeah, I think you said that well, Simon. So the brain doesn't separate thinking and feeling under its healthiest state. We've learned to silence our emotions. We've learned our emotions are not welcome at times. So that when a conceptual shift happens, I think it's more accurate to believe that there's a strong link between an emotional shift, a conceptual shift, that happening at the same time. And I don't know what we feel first, whether we see the concept shift or we feel the emotion changing. But for me, they're very integrated with each other if we are aware, if we allow ourselves. So there's a lot of repression that goes along with not feeling our feelings and not hearing our thoughts. Best case scenario, we're thinking and feeling in an integrated way. But thanks for your question, Simon. Does that make sense?
It does, and it strikes me as being a helpful clarification, and it reinforces the idea that part of spiritual care competency is building that robust sense of self-awareness. But on the front lines of care, because we in the West are so skilled in repressing our emotions, at least in my own practice, as I'm engaging a client at the bedside, I'm drawing attention to the emotional dimensions of their story so that we can work to rebuild that integration within their own capacity for self-reflection.
Right. Part of the book addresses 4 spiritual styles that I think actually can respond to what you're saying right now, that people need different things. And part of another whole aspect of my research that Margaret made me bring into this book, because I never would have made the connection myself, more gratitude to you, Margaret, is that spiritual styles: word, emotion, symbol, and action. And I recommend you reflecting on that, because one of the questions, if I'm a word person, people need to be clear with their words with me first, or I find it more difficult to connect with them emotionally. So I think part of the dynamic of spiritual care practice is beginning to understand who I'm speaking with and what they need from me in order for them to deeply feel, I get what they're asking for, and I can interpret what they need. So for me, give me the right words or move on, because I need to know that your conceptions are acceptable to me. But somebody else is going to need that, are you feeling what I'm feeling experience before they can trust us. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I would say that that's a crucial piece of the spiritual care assessment skill, in terms of being able to get a quick read on that person's preference and orientation in life so that we can engage it effectively. So thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Other questions? Yes, Berna.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Well, first of all, I'm just overwhelmed. I expected to be impressed because Dr. Bellous was my professor when I was a much younger person. But I am literally overwhelmed. The title of the book in and of itself has given me words that describe my practice. I am a chaplain, a spiritual care practitioner at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So it's a tertiary care academic health science center, and things move really fast. When I saw the announcement about today's learning opportunity, it was just like a couple days ago. So I got the Kindle version of the book and just had time to read the introduction. And I'm just really looking forward to reading the rest. But I wonder, I'm trying to think, which question should I ask? Okay, I'm going to ask a question about intersectionality. And it might be addressed in the book, and perhaps you can even point me to the chapter, because when you're in an acute care setting, things happen really fast. You don't have a lot of time to get to know people before you are in one of those thin moments. Sometimes that's our introduction to the person. The child has had a traumatic event or cardiac arrest or something like that. And there are all of these other things that come into play, like, race and gender and the family system that they came out of. And for me, I feel like, I don't know if there's another way to do it, because when you're showing up in that thin moment, there are things that you have to intuit by their body language, their tone of voice. So yeah, maybe point me to where I would look for some guidance around things that I should pay attention to, because I have to move fast.
And Margaret.
Well, we do make reference to intersectionality, although we don't take a deep dive into that concept, but it's integral. It's exactly what you're saying. It's like we bring to any encounter with any other human person, we bring who we are. And that includes our gender, our race, our religious beliefs, our socioeconomic status, the whole variety that's there. And sometimes when we meet people, we resonate with an aspect of ourself that intersects with an aspect of them where we're aligned, and it's similar, and we feel, in a sense, a closeness due to that. But at other times, we bump into an intersection where we have differences, and where we have a little harder, not only a little, sometimes a much harder time being able to talk across our differences. So I think in chapter 5, where we talk about the other as other, we've tried to look a little bit into that whole challenge and invitation of being able to talk across our differences with respect, with empathy, with contemplative mindfulness, with intentional reflection. And I think intentional reflection isn't something we necessarily set a, you know, we go off someplace and we do intentional reflection. I think we're doing intentional reflection all the time. And so if we stay reflective in the moment, we might pick up those things that vibrate inside of us, that affect us in engaging ways, in kind of push back ways, that kind of thing. So chapter 5 is a big one in terms of your question, Verna.
Love you, Verna.
Thank you, Verna. Great question. It sounds like you have a couple others, so maybe keep them on the queue if you want to get them into. But I'm going to jump in for a quick second and ask a question, maybe tease something out here from Margaret and Joyce. The subtitle of the book, Theoretical Groundwork in Spiritual Care Practice. I want to ask the question, why a book on theoretical groundwork? And maybe just tease out, are there maybe other things down the pipeline that you might want to share with us?
That's a good question. I'm going to jump in first, and then Margaret and I agreed that we were writing at some point along the way. Margaret and I agreed that we were really focused on theoretical groundwork. And I think it connects back up with the whole idea of worldview. I enjoy reading Immanuel Kant, who 1700s, and really shaped the way the modern worldview, we could say. And for him, although he's this incredibly theoretical philosopher, he was really clear that a good theory should work in practice. It is an idea you take on and you find out through experience whether this idea works or not. And in the 20th century, educational situations at every level really dissed theory as cold, irrelevant. That is such a failure to understand how the brain works. And I think the issue is action science, which we addressed in the first chapter. All action is theory driven. And we've been very poor at articulating the theories that we're operating on, which goes back to Verna's questions as well. You know, because my theories about another person will get in the way unless I know what they are. So to think that I can be a spiritual practitioner without having theories, without recognizing theories, without naming my theories in action is, well, I will try not to be rude. So Margaret better start.
Well, I too like that, theories in action. When I was in CPE, because I'm kind of an old timer, I've been around in the CPE world for over 50 years. And we had very little theoretical groundwork. By the time I got into residency, we did have some psychological theories that we began to learn. So some were in Jung, some were in object relations theory and that kind of thing. But by and large, we tended to operate on what George Fitzet very beautifully put in his book on spiritual assessing spiritual needs. He talked about kind of the fly by the seat of your pants approach to doing spiritual care, right? That a lot of us, you know, if we got in the room and we made a nice connection and we knew when people said, well, it was nice that you were here, chaplain, that we knew that that was a clue, it's time to leave, that we felt success. But what I find is that as I've worked with Joyce, I have learned so much that I wish I had when I was in clinical pastoral education, because it's the most well-rounded approach to theory that I've ever experienced in what we've constructed or tried to construct. There's depth of field that can be done in a lot of theories. And of course, there's a lot of theories that are not there, that are operative and are popular in our practice. But I think if we, I think when I was learning to be a chaplain, I was afraid that if I looked too theoretical, it would be too technical, too methodological, too rigid. And I wanted to be free-flowing and relational and all that kind of stuff. But what I find is in spiritual assessment, the more we know, the better we can read the other person. It's not an analytical reading. Like our analytical mind is only an aspect of our mind, but we also have a way of knowing that is intuitive. It's all that, like Joyce has contributed greatly, I think, in chapter 7 to different intelligences. We bring all of that with us. We have our favorites, and if we can draw on those, our favorites, but also integrate others that are not, it's a part of that lifelong learning process. So I really hope we can, and I know we are as a profession, or especially over the last 20 years, we've been moving away from kind of the, I can do it because I fly by the seat of my pants, to a more informed practice, especially professional practice of spiritual care.
That flying by the seat of your pants is such a useful expression if we don't think about our thinking. Another way of saying that from John Dewey, American philosopher John Dewey, is if people don't think about their thinking, it's as if they are always pushed from behind. And so I think both of those notions contribute directly to us regaining our respect for theory without thinking that theory is the only thing involved.
What I hear you both saying is this is really about integrating mind and body. If we're accustomed to flying by the seat of our pants, well, that's what we do with our body, how we act, how we interact, right, all those things. But let's not lose the mind in that and integrate those to really have a depth of person. So you've got a book on theoretical groundwork. Any other books in the hopper? And then Simon will come to you.
Margaret, we're doing a case study book based on thick listening at thin moments. I can't say that, which is in the works. Yeah.
Okay.
We've been benefited, like Anton Boyson, who's attributed to be one of the founders of the clinical pastoral education movement since the early 1920s, did a lot of his work using case studies. And then George Fichette introduced and encouraged research in spiritual care practice, because we tended to be more clinicians and we avoided research. And he kept nurturing research in our profession and has done so for literally several decades. And he introduced a article on case study research as it called Making Our Cases, which has been really so rich. Case studies are part of the professional practice requirements to be certified in the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. Sometimes verbatims and other records are used in other, like in the US, in several of the spiritual care associations. So we're hoping to put together a book of case studies that isn't case study research as such, but is people telling the stories of their relationships with patients and or other people, other bodies, other communities, and telling those stories, having drawn on some of the theories in thick listening at the moment. So hopefully that'll come out in the next year or so.
That's great to hear. So all of us on the call, we can stay tuned. Volume 2 coming, case studies, building on this theoretical groundwork. That's great. Simon, yeah.
I just wanted to add my voice to the question of why theory is important, and I love what you said, Joyce, just about the need to reflect on our thinking. But I would also like to say that there are some very pragmatic reasons as to why theory is important as well, in the sense that our lack of theory is really inhibiting our effectiveness at the front lines, not only in terms of how we interact with patients and their families, but also how we communicate what we're doing to those whom we're working alongside. And so I think that pragmatically that has resulted in spiritual care practitioners often being marginalized in our workplaces because we don't have the language. We don't have the language to describe what we're doing and to identify clear outcomes that we're anticipating for the care that we provide. And so I think, I'm keenly interested in this conversation and this dimension of your work, because not only is this a problem here in Canada, but it's a problem internationally, to the extent that I've heard of colleagues in the research world having funding applications denied for spiritual care research because they lacked a theoretical foundation. So again, I just want to reiterate what I said earlier in terms of the value of this work, and how I think it's really going to play a crucial role in advancing the conversation, not only here in Canada, but also internationally.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. You're so, you're so helpful in all of this. So I taught an adult learning course at Taylor, and for spiritual care practice. And one of the images that I have from the students in that class is, there they are in the hospital room. The spiritual care practitioner is right beside the patient, has made that felt connection with the patient. And bless their hearts, the doctors and the students are all standing in the doorway, looking at the patient from a distance, because doctors believe distance is the right theoretical stance for doing the best job with patients. And clinical and spiritual care practitioners believe that standing near is the best way to minister to the person lying in that bed. And how do those two theoretical perspectives begin to converse with each other? That's, for me, a very interesting question.
And I think that that's the emerging question for us in the field as well, is, I mean, what I like to say using my own terminology is that we all have a frame for reality, somewhat akin to what you describe in terms of worldview, but it's the role of the spiritual care practitioner to co-inhabit the frame for reality with the patient that they're working with, so that they can work within the bounds of that frame to enhance the patient's spiritual well-being. And so given that we have that close sense of connection with the patient, as opposed to the medical practitioners who are approaching the patients at arm's length, in some ways, we have a better understanding of what the patient is experiencing from within their own frame than the medical practitioners do. And so I think that that's an opportunity to develop communication strategies between the different professionals on the teams that will somehow give the medical professionals a better understanding of the experiential dimensions of the patient's medical incident or whatever, but how to do that effectively while not betraying confidentiality and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
That's a very concrete question that I think we need to work out systematically.
And just as you're saying that, Simon, I'm thinking theoretically about understanding the dangers of standing far away, the dangers and the benefits, and the dangers and the benefits of standing near, which can become too near, right? So it's not, I mean, I guess I'm committed to a collaboration in which that sort of theoretical problem that you're talking about, and Margaret has mentioned numerous times, and all my students in that adult learning class brought to the forefront, how do we have a conversation about nearness and difference, and distance and indifference can sometimes be the way. So how do we have that conversation with both stances, understand their weaknesses and their strengths, what they contribute, and what they and the harm that could be caused by those two postures toward the person in the bed?
Absolutely. And I would say that in some ways it harkens back to the traditional priestly function that that spiritual care practitioners have had in their past, in terms of being mediators between the sacred and the profane, so to speak, mediating the divine presence into everyday realities. In some ways, that in-between space that spiritual care practitioners operate in their workplaces, mediating the experiences of the patient to the medical practitioners, requires a sense of bounded distance, both from the patient and from the medical practitioners, so that the spiritual care practitioners themselves can maximize their efficacy in that mediation work.
Yeah.
Really rich conversation. Sorry, Margaret, go ahead.
I'm just saying it's an ongoing process, and that's that sense of that we need to keep building on one another's works that are coming out. I think we've grown a lot in the last couple of decades, and I think we're continuing to, and grateful for all the people that continue to contribute.
Yes, Ralph.
Thank you, Fred. And just a privilege to be here with Joyce and Margaret. And so much congratulations from my end. Those who don't know me, you're probably happy to not know me. No, just kidding. I'm at Taylor Seminary. I used to be the academic dean, and in that capacity, worked with Margaret and Joyce and Don McNaught and Fred and others in terms of filling in sort of the CPE gap that the Alberta government left in terms of how our theological colleges could contribute to that development of spiritual care practitioners. And what I'm looking forward to learning, and maybe you might be able to give me some comments on this, but as I'm listening, I know, Joyce, you consistently prioritize, and Margaret as well, the ministry of presence. That was a phrase I kept hearing from you, which I so appreciated. And it seems to me that this book is sort of that distillation and explication of what does ministry of presence practically look like, act like, think like, feel like. And I'm looking forward to digging into your book more to, just as I'm hearing all these comments, like, this is going to be a real rich journey for me as I get a chance to read into that. So I appreciate all the work you've done and the privilege of having walked with you guys for years, and miss the regular connections with our group. And but it's a joy to see everybody here and participate in that regard.
Ralph was the best boss I ever had.
It was a joy, Joyce.
Yeah, I mean, the sense of presence that you name, that's something Margaret and I both feel very strongly about. And that's a learned practice, isn't it? To actually be present to ourselves equally, and as we're present to another person, without letting either other person, ourselves or the other, get in the way of that, what is sometimes a thin moment between two people. And that I'm still learning so much more. I recommend Simone Weil on that topic, actually. French philosopher Simone Weil, who felt by being present to another, we actually bring their humanity into existence. And she uses the Good Samaritan as an example of actually realizing the humanity of the other by this practice of being fully present. And I find that works extremely well with very young children. And I love that.
How do you spell her last name, Joyce? Excuse me.
Weil. I say Weil. Some people say they. Simone, W-E-I-L, French philosopher. She was Jewish. She was very seriously thinking about becoming a Christian, and one of the most respected women philosophers in the 20th century.
Okay, thank you.
W-E-I-L.
Okay, appreciate that.
Thank you, Ralph. Friends, I'm happy for our conversation to continue, though I am conscious that it's 12:30 here in Edmonton and later for many of you, maybe earlier for those on the West Coast. And we said we would go up until this time. So if any of you have to leave, please feel free to do so. So let me take a second to pop again into our chats, the link at the publisher's website, and gratitude to the publisher that they've put a discount on this week. The code is book launch. If you enter that when you purchase the book, you'll get 10% off. My gratitude to Margaret and to Joyce and to Leslie for leading us today in such a rich reflection on this very fine book. But more importantly, my gratitude to Margaret and Joyce for composing this very fine book and giving us the gift of this book that we can read it and reflect on it and chew on it, and that it will live on with us for many, many years to come. I'm grateful that we can all be together, and we, as I said, we have recorded this so we can listen back. There are lots of praise and comments in the chat, so before you log off, I do invite you to go and take a look at those. And of course, we can stay on and ask any other questions, but I will formally say that our time has come to a close, and any of you who have to go, please feel free to go. But I'll stick around if anyone wants to ask a few more questions. I'll invite Leslie and Margaret and Joyce to do so as well.